So IGN has just released a bunch of new gameplay and info on the new combat stances within Jedi Survivor. I literally had just sat down to make another video and I checked Twitter, and what do you know, there is essentially an 8-minute video talking about all the new stances and gameplay. So I quickly changed my plans and that's what we're going to be going through today. I'll be breaking down everything you guys need to know from the information that IGN have given us. Now, we already knew that there were going to be 5 stances in the game. We also know what they're all going to be. That is the single blade stance, which is obviously just a regular lightsaber. We then have the double blade stance, which is when the saber is the same as Darth Maul, for example. We then have twin blade or dual wielding. They refer to it as twin blade, so that's essentially what I'm going to call it from here on out. And that is obviously using 2 different sabers, similar to how Ahsoka does it. We then have the crossguard stance, which is when the saber actually looks similar to Kylo Ren's saber, and it becomes essentially a heavy lightsaber. And then we also know that there is a blaster stance as well. So we've already known that, but we now do have some gameplay of all of the first 4 stances. We do not have, unfortunately, any gameplay of the blaster stance. I'm pretty sure they'll be keeping that a little bit secret until later on, because that is obviously going to be very different from the rest of them, but we do actually still have some information from what IGN told us. So even though we don't get to see it, we do at least know a little bit more than we did prior to today. Now, they mentioned that the first 3 stances, that being the single blade, the double blade, and the twin blade, they are all available from the very start of the game. I'm sure there will be a very small period at the start where you've probably got to learn how to use the twin blade, for example, so it might not be right away, but pretty much in the first mission or so, from there on out, we will be able to use those first 3. And then as for the crossguard and the blaster, I'm going to assume that they will just become available to use when the story permits it, essentially. So we see in the trailer that Cal kind of gets that crossguard saber, he lights it up and he looks a little bit confused at it. That will obviously no doubt be a part of the storyline where it looks like you fight that guy with the yellow saber who's already got the crossguard on it. You probably defeat him and then you get to use the crossguard from there on out. And then same sort of thing for the blaster. Maybe when Cal meets Bode has a spare blaster and he gives it to him or something like that. So those 2 will be essentially unlocked throughout the story. Now, they then went into a little bit of detail about all 5 of the stances. Firstly, touching on the single blade and the double blade, we already know what they're going to be like. We have obviously used both of them in Fallen Order. It sounds like they're going to be essentially the exact same as they were in Fallen Order, where the single blade is kind of just like the jack of all trades. It's really just like the base attack type or the base stance. It doesn't really have any negatives to it, but it also doesn't really have any positives. It's just like the safe option, I guess you would say. And then as for the double blade, we also know that that was a bit more for sort of crowd control. If there's a bunch of weaker enemies around you, you can equip that double blade and you can kind of deal damage to multiple enemies at once. So for example, when there's a bunch of clankers in Jedi Survivor, they're obviously going to be very weak enemies. We see that in the gameplay already. They're pretty much a one-hit kill. So in that instance, bringing out that double blade is going to allow you to pretty much just chop down multiple enemies at once. And it's really just like an area of effect type of attack rather than singling out one enemy and hitting them individually. Now, as for the twin blade, obviously we haven't had that in this franchise before. We did have one attack in Fallen Order that was really just like a finisher, or it was kind of the end of a combo more than anything. But in this game, it's obviously going to be an entire stance, so you could pretty much play twin blade the entire game if you want to. They mentioned that this is essentially a high risk, high reward type of playstyle. They mentioned you are pretty much a glass cannon when you're in this stance, so that obviously means you're going to take a lot of damage. If you do get hit, if you're not hitting your dodges or not blocking at the right time, you will take more damage. But in saying that, you also attack faster and you do have a lot of agility when it comes to dodging and blocking. For example, they mentioned that it's the only stance where you can actually start an attack, and yet if an enemy goes to hit you, you can actually block and sort of cancel out that attack that you were about to do. Whereas with every other stance in the game, if you start an attack and then someone swings at you, you can't actually pull out of that attack. You've got to wait till the attack's done and then you can block. So this twin blade stance is going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be really high risk, high reward, which I know for me personally, that's always a really fun way to play. And it looks like there's a lot of really good combos, as you guys can see in the gameplay in the background. And by the way, this is all new gameplay. Some of these combos look really, really fun. So this for me, I'm pretty sure is going to be my favorite to play. It definitely looks like a lot of fun to me. Now, as for the crossguard stance, we obviously know already that this is kind of like a heavy attack. It's going to make the lightsaber feel a little bit more beefy, which, to be fair, in canon, I'm not really sure how that works, because lightsabers are meant to be pretty much weightless outside of the hilt. I think the exception maybe being the darksaber. So I'm not sure how that works with canon necessarily, but obviously for gameplay reasons, that has to be the case. And the way they described that is that they wanted us as a player to feel powerful when we're using the crossguard. So it's a very slow stance to use. The attacks take a long time to actually, charge up and move your lightsaber towards the enemy, but it deals the most amount of damage of any of these stances. And we actually see in this gameplay here that Cal is one-shotting these scout troopers. Now, if you've played Fallen Order, you know that they're not a one-hit kill. Most of them are a 2-hit kill, and then they obviously block your attacks as well, so sometimes it'll take like 3 or 4 hits to actually kill them. This crossguard is making that a 1-hit kill, so that kind of just shows the damage there. It looks like it potentially might deal double the damage, but again, it is kind of high risk, high reward because it is slow with its attack speed. So if you start swinging at an enemy, that's a longer period of time that you can't really block. And so there is a bit of a like rock, paper, scissors element to all of this, where you gain an advantage if you use one of these stances, but then you're also getting a negative impact as well, which I think is really good for gameplay, and it's going to add a lot of variety. Now, like I said, unfortunately we don't have any gameplay just yet of the blaster stance. They did mention a few things though. The first thing to keep in mind is that it's not just a full-on blaster. They mentioned this isn't a shooter, it's still obviously a melee combat game, and so it's not like you can just pull out a blaster and just have unlimited ammunition and just take everyone out from range. They mentioned it does have a similar kind of charge up ability to it, almost the same as your force powers. So you all know, if you played Fallen Order, you've run out of force powers, and the only way to really charge it back up is by attacking enemies, and when you land a successful hit, you get a little bit of force power back. It's going to be pretty much the same thing with the blaster. So for example, you might get 5 shots with it, and then if you don't use your saber, it won't charge back up. So I think that's a really good choice. It would be kind of boring if you could just use a blaster the whole time, because I know for me, having played, for example, a game like Elden Ring, when you choose like the mage type of playstyle, you can just attack enemies from further back, and it's kind of just like an easy way to play the game, which, to be fair, I get that not everyone is going to be really good at the game, and for those people it's probably a nicer, easier way to play the game. But I do think there needs to be some balance there, and this seems like it's a pretty good balance to where you can still do that ranged damage, but you can't just do it permanently. You have to maybe take out 1 or 2 enemies with the blaster, and then you can't use it until you go and actually attack them with your lightsaber. So I'm a big fan of that, and I'm definitely very keen to actually see some proper gameplay. I'd imagine it won't be too much longer until we actually see some, because that's obviously a huge addition to this game that wasn't there in Fallen Order. Now, there were 2 more things that they mentioned that are definitely very interesting. Firstly, all 5 stances have got their own skill tree. Obviously in Fallen Order, there was kind of just one skill tree, and it did have different tangents. So for example, the left was like the force powers, the middle was like your combat, and the right was all of your survivability. But at the end of the day, it was just one skill tree, and you could kind of go in essentially any direction you wanted. In this game, all 5 of these stances are going to have their own skill tree, and then they are still going to have 1 tree each for your force powers and 1 for survivability too. So that's really important to know, and I do like that as well, because it's kind of going to promote, you know, if I really like that twin blade, then I'm going to sort of put all of my points into that skill tree, but then it's going to mean that I'm not as good when it comes to, say, the crossguard. And I think that's a good thing, because otherwise, if you're just a beast at every single one, it's going to be kind of overpowered. And to me, that just adds a bit of replayability. I might do the first playthrough with just like the double blade and the twin blade, and then the next one I just do single blade and crossguard, and it might feel very different playing it each time. So I'm definitely a big fan of that. Now, the last thing that I found this very interesting, and I got a feeling some people aren't going to like this, but for me personally, I actually really like this choice. We can only equip 2 stances at a time, and these can be changed at the meditation points. So we aren't going to be running around as Cal and just switching between all 5 stances. You can't just use your single blade and then switch to your double blade and then bring out your blaster and then go to the twin blade. That is not how it's going to work. You can only equip 2 at a time, and we've seen that on the HUD down in the bottom left. There's only 2 options there. It looks like it'll be left on the D-pad for the left one, obviously, and right on the D-pad for the right one. And so this for me is a really good choice, because it means that we can't just be overpowered and be equipped for every situation. For example, I might be running just a single blade and then a twin blade, and then it gets to a certain point in the game where the enemies that I'm about to face, they kind of need a bit of a ranged attack, and I might have to switch to that blaster, but then we're going to have to give up one of my other attacks or stances in order to get that range from the blaster. So I'm sure some people will feel like that's kind of limiting us a little bit, but I do think that's a really good decision. It's going to play into that whole learning which enemy types need which type of stance to actually defeat them. So you might go to a meditation point before you enter into a boss fight, for example. You might think, okay, this boss might need this and this. You bring those different stances and you get absolutely murked, and then when you respawn at that meditation point, you might go, okay, that didn't work, I need to try some of these other stances. And essentially it's going to cause for some like experimentation that we need to do, which I personally really like. I really enjoy trying to figure out the enemies. Sometimes you've got to take a bit of an L to go, okay, that didn't work, I'm going to have to try something else here. And to me, it's almost the same way that like puzzles can be really rewarding. When you finally finish a puzzle, you feel really good about it, and you go, okay, I was smart enough to finish that puzzle. It's kind of the same thing, but on steroids with a boss fight, because not only do you have to learn the boss and what they need to be attacked with, but then you've actually got to go and do it as well. So I'm a very, very big fan of that choice. I think if we had all 5 stances on command, it would just be too overpowered and it'd be a little bit boring personally. So definitely a fan of that. But with that said, I'm keen to hear what you guys think, whether you like that decision or whether you're not a fan of it. So be sure to leave your thoughts on it down in the comment section. That's all the news that we got from today's IGN post. There will definitely be more news on the way. They're pretty much putting something out every 2 or 3 days at this point. So keep your eyes peeled right here on the channel. There's obviously going to be way more content on the way. Pretty much anytime they're going to tweet anything or put a video out on anything, I'm going to break it down for you guys. So if you're not subbed, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day and may the force be with you always.